you look at the sheer amount of metadata that exists at all levels within Salesforce, you plug that into, AI with an AI copilot with some parameters around how you want it to handle specific situations. You look at something like tech debt remediation effectively on autopilot. Whether we're there right now or we're about to be there, we're going to get there very quickly, and that's going to be a massive unlock.
So I'm delighted to be talking to Max Maeder from Found HQ. And the reason I wanted to talk to him is that he's got the website's amazing. You go to the website and it's got the breakdown of, this is the team that are running Salesforce for a particular well-known customer, someone a company you would recognize. And it's got the number of admins, the structure of how many devs. So first of all, Max, where do you find all this information? And then the second question is, are those companies happy about having that put on your website?
Yeah, and thanks for having me on. It's great to chat with you. So, a lot of the information, the research, the analysis we do is done from largely publicly available information, right? So probably 85% of the data that we are publishing is out there. Yes, we're extracting it and compiling it and analyzing it. So it's not all sitting in one place, but it's out there. So we're not revealing anything proprietary. And I think when we do publish, a team breakdown, which is effectively us saying, here is company X, Zillow, MongoDB, for example, we're highlighting specifically how their Salesforce and broader enterprise applications team is resourced and structured, but we're doing so to effectively say, this is how it should be done. Here are particular standout areas of their team. Here are roles that are unique to this team, but should be more broadly adopted. So we're really publishing these in I think, complementary way. That tends to be the feedback that we get. Sometimes there's a little bit of surprise that we know the amount that we do know, but it's all meant to, prioritize and promote best practices when it comes to, internal Salesforce team building.
I find it illuminating. I mean, to see the structure of teams, which you rarely get to do, and I think that, again, illuminating, but also really instructive. If you're standing up a team and knowing, okay, based on your objectives, and I said those teams will be quite specific to what that team's trying to achieve, but understanding the breakdowns is really helpful. So, if you've done a lot of these, you must be seeing some trends.
Yeah, certainly. I do think on the whole, companies are beginning to get more sophisticated in how they view Salesforce and therefore how they invest in Salesforce. I think if you look 5-6 years ago, which is still relatively recent, I think there was an enormous knowledge gap that existed within the ecosystem. And I, partially, and I've said this to, many folks at all levels within Salesforce, I think Salesforce is partially to blame or to take the ownership over that lack of knowledge of, great, I'm going to purchase Salesforce. They're going to help me identify a qualified consulting firm that is, knowledgeable of my industry, of the products that I'm planning to adopt. The implementation is, in most cases, going to go relatively smooth, but there's a real lack of education around what comes next. So you deploy Salesforce at any scale. How do you then receive that implementation from a consulting firm and be competent and capable of continuing to evolve and craft a strategic roadmap that works for the organization on a long-term basis? So, I think that one of the big realizations just in the last couple of years is that companies are starting to understand a little bit more about what the composition of their team needs to look like. And there's still gaps that exist that we can talk about. And really that it comes down to being willing to invest in specific resources early on. Because if you invest in the right systems leadership or product owners or architects, you fall into this, this culture where you're able to proactively plan on a much longer time horizon, and you're less likely to just be building for the here and now. Requests come in from users and they get built by admins. Strategic initiatives or ideas come from stakeholders and they immediately funnel right into like the delivery and production process. That kind of reactive build can really easily paint you in a corner. And so I think because companies are investing in dedicated resources earlier on, what that means is they're becoming slightly less reliant on consulting firms for large ongoing needs because they have the internal knowledge to either build it themselves, design and build it themselves, or they have a sophisticated enough roadmap that they can be more precise with what resources they need to bring in at specific times. And so that then opens up a whole new field of resourcing options, which is going out and finding independent Salesforce consultants, basically contractors who often come from a consulting firm, but they're independent business owners. And so they're typically their pricing model is lower than a consulting firm. Their engagement model is more flexible and sort of open-ended. So you can then get really surgical with saying, hey, I need this type of resource for this 4 to 6 week period that overlaps with our broader delivery timeline. And there's efficiency gains, there's, cost reduction measures that come with that. So I think it is about a big trend is, companies knowing a little bit more about when and how to invest early, and then all the kind of cascading benefits that come from that.
So we're seeing a lot more emphasis on the upfront planning. So I mean, business analysts. So obviously there's a Salesforce certification there. Architects. Obviously Salesforce has invested massively to put together the architect program. And there's Center of Excellence. Let's pick that up later. But I've also heard the term fractional architect, which I think plays back to what you just said, which is maybe coming to Found HQ because you just want a specific resource for a period of time. Because the architecture needs to be done up front, or security needs to be done up front. So, Found HQ has got, as I understand, contractors that you can take as individuals or as groups. Can you just talk about how that works from a...
Yeah, exactly. So we're essentially set up as a very niched down freelancers marketplace. So we have 7,000 global Salesforce contractors available for projects through the platform. So that covers, every discipline, admin, engineer, architect, BA, et cetera, across all Salesforce product areas. Everyone is vetted before they're given access to the platform. So we have those quality controls in place. And then companies basically come, they either book a, discovery call or just list a project on the platform. And we then match them specifically to individual contractors, or we put together a bespoke team of contractors to come in and deliver a set scope of work. And so the use cases that we see are incredibly varied. You see strategic project work that companies often will just kick out to a consulting firm who obviously shows up with a full team ready to go and a delivery methodology. If you're able to plan internally and you have that that level of sophistication around your roadmap, generally how things need to get done from an architectural and integration perspective, you can very effectively plug contractors in when it's really just about a team to deliver on that. And then we also see a lot of very fractional utilization. So use cases and needs where companies don't really need that as a dedicated full-time hire, but they have a short-term need or a short-term initiative that requires fairly specialized experience. And so we see that a lot around something like Salesforce CPQ. That's definitely a big one as companies are looking to do revamps there, or just some of the peripheral products like, field service. You've got to be a massive org to need, dedicated field service architects. But obviously, Salesforce is a living, breathing product. And so when the needs come for you to actually make significant changes, at some level, it's helpful to kind of pull someone in for, 4, 6, 8 week projects to handle that and then get out. And then we also do sort of staff augmentation, just companies that are looking to boost capabilities or capacity, short term or long term.
So, and this is fantastic because it plays back to me and my soapbox by going, if you don't plan correctly, then you're not going to build the right stuff. If you don't architect it, if you don't build the security model correctly, it's going to come back and bite you in terms of all complexity or tech debt. But I think quite often organizations go, well, we can't afford to put someone on the staff full time. But with people like you, they don't need to. So that's no longer an excuse. The excuse of, oh, they're quite expensive. The answer is, well, have you seen the cost of getting it wrong? So actually trying to encourage people to do, okay, be clear about the scope. Let's get a small piece of work, and then deliver it at the right time in the project, which is obvious early on if you can. Makes a lot of
Right.
sense.
And I also think, on that, I think the topic of, the total cost of ownership of Salesforce is obviously one that gets discussed a lot. And I think there's a lot to sort of parse through with, facts and figures that you may see out there. I think Salesforce even put something out where it's, and this is maybe a couple years old, but probably still stands up, where it's, the total cost of ownership of managing Salesforce is something like $5 or $6 spent per $1 in license fees, right? So you look at that as a big company, and it sounds outrageous. That's an enormous expense. First of all, I think that data is skewed a little bit by the fact that a lot of companies are investing too late. And so if you invest too late, you either paint yourself into a corner that you need to work your way out of, or you accumulate, large amounts of technical debt, where then a huge percentage of your engineering team's bandwidth in each release is going towards tech debt remediation. So getting things wrong at the start means your total cost of ownership is ultimately going to be higher in the long run. Getting things right at the beginning means that statistic, in my opinion, is irrelevant. And I think the second piece to that is really viewing Salesforce resources as expensive. It really is a sort of perception is reality type of situation, right? I think if you view the Salesforce team as a cost or a cost center from day one, it becomes difficult to invest in the platform to the extent needed to really generate maximum ROI, right? I think if you think Salesforce engineers are too expensive, you're not really thinking big enough about the level of impact Salesforce can have on the organization. And therefore, those hires become a net positive in terms of ROI. And I think one anecdote that I love is, you look at a company like Ticketmaster, right? The global, ticketing management, marketplace, live events business. I sort of joke that the entire Ticketmaster business and really the Ticketmaster core product, right? Their website where you purchase a ticket and check out and manage, your shows, et cetera. The entire Ticketmaster product is basically just a UI that sits on top of Salesforce.
Wow.
Everything behind the scenes and under the surface is run through Salesforce at Ticketmaster, right? So it's customer acquisition run through Marketing Cloud. It's all customer support and fan applications and experience run through Service Cloud with, some AI and ML capabilities. It's some custom apps for, ticket agents. It's quote to pay processing managed through Salesforce, right? That entire business, which is enormous, is run through Salesforce. Now, all that said, think about the fact that Ticketmaster has something like 700 engineers on the core product and engineering team. They have about 50 people full time on the Salesforce team, right? So that engineer's cost starts to seem like nothing if you zoom out and say, if this is what we can do with Salesforce, it's a lot cheaper than trying to, build all of these kind of custom applications that aren't really necessary. The infrastructure exists and you can do it with a far leaner team because it's already out there and you just need to build on top of it.
That's just a fascinating way of looking at it. I think people talk about user adoption and going, well, actually, we bought, 10,000 licenses, but we've only deployed 2,000 of them. That makes those 2,000 licenses really expensive. You need to get all 10,000 deployed, which means you need to build the right thing so users adopt them and then make sure that they're using them. And then how do you extend it to make sure that every single thing they're doing is on the Salesforce platform, and therefore you're not supporting other third-party applications? And I think that requires a more strategic approach than saying, "Oh, this is great for managing our contacts, and we can do a bit more with it." So, are you seeing a trend of people engaging in Salesforce in a more strategic way now? Do you think?
I think so. Yeah, I think that is beginning to happen because of, what we touched on earlier, which is the fact that companies are investing in the right internal team earlier on in that journey, and it just creates that sort of culture of innovation around Salesforce. But there still are organizations operating at scale that have key elements of their team either missing or dramatically under resourced, which create a ton of friction and sort of bottlenecks in the Salesforce team then being able to function as a proactive source of product innovation. And I think the big two are really the business analyst discipline and the product manager discipline, right? So when you look at the structure of where the Salesforce team sits within an organization, if you're operating at scale, you're mid-market or enterprise, that really needs to be a centralized team that sits within, if you've got a CIO, it sits within the CIO's org. Otherwise, it may sit within some other technology or engineering, discipline. But you need to house all of your internal tools headcount together. You can't scale beyond a very early stage startup and have RevOps manage go-to-market systems, marketing manage marketing systems, finance manage NetSuite or whatever you have in place, because then you've just got this very siloed systems team and the right hand's not talking to the left. So when you centralize them, the big challenge that exists is, great, how do we facilitate the level of collaboration that needs to exist between that centralized technology team and the business units they serve? Because they no longer are housed within those business units the way they were at the very beginning. And so that bridge really needs to be, filled by the BSA and the product manager, where they effectively have sort of a dotted line reporting structure, right? They live within the centralized technology organization. But the way you want to set it up is that a BSA or a product manager is also embedded within a specific business unit or a specific work stream within a business unit or to specific stakeholders within a business unit. And if you're, a massive global sales organization, that might mean you have 4 PMs dedicated to sales, and each of them have their own sort of cluster of stakeholders. Because then what you get is top-down planning from the centralized Salesforce team. Hey, here is the 2 to 3 year product roadmap that we're planning, that we think makes sense for the organizational needs, makes sense from an integration and data strategy perspective. Here's what we're planning. That then needs to be, those insights, those plans need to be funneled back into the business to make sure that you're creating alignment, to make sure that you're gathering needs that perhaps have been overlooked by just the technology team, and they're really gathering insights from the ground, from the front line, that are then synthesized back into the centralized team and create this sort of cyclical product roadmap planning that has both sound architectural decisions being made by the Salesforce team, but also has all of the business context and business insights needed to make sure that you're actually building what needs to be built. And without having those embedded resources sort of aligned to the business teams, you're missing a sort of key piece of that, that collaboration and that feedback loop. But setting it up like that, when done successfully, you then have sort of perfect cohesion between systems expertise and operational and process level knowledge.
So that's talking to everything I care about, which is, Elements is that collaboration platform, which is where all the data sits clearly. But this seems to be a center of excellence. Is that what you're now seeing it called?
Yeah, I think that is still very much the term. I think there's a lot of companies who have that, but maybe they don't know the term, or maybe they're not calling it that. But that is exactly what we're talking about. Yeah, a center of excellence.
Good, because we're seeing that more and more now in terms of organizations I think they're recognizing that a center of excellence isn't necessarily a body of people who all sit at the center, but it's actually a set of disciplines which they all need to carry out no matter where they report to, because you're not necessarily going to change your reporting structure because you want to build a center of excellence, but you still need all those disciplines you've just talked about, the idea of top-down planning, meeting actually the business needs, and then that feeding into what actually gets delivered in terms of releases. So I think everything's going in the right direction. The barrier seems to be, do they care about resourcing at the right level? Can they find the right resources? And not abdicating responsibility to a consulting firm. Because I think we see that a lot, which, the consultants will do that. The answer is, well, then you don't own it, which I think, again, I love the idea of actually being able to pull off resources when you need them from, say, someone like Found HQ. But then what happens if do those people from Found HQ, can they then make it into full-time jobs, or what happens then?
Yeah, I mean, there's varied, use cases. There are plenty of companies where, they're looking to sort of start with a staff augmentation team just as they evaluate what, amount of capacity they need on development or admin headcount. And then, let's say they spin up a team of 10 contractors. They have those contractors for 6 months. They may convert, five or six of them and then say, oh, the over the, those 2 quarters, we don't need a full 10. We're good with just these six, and they can convert them to full time. And that's something that we see a lot of, specifically with companies that are looking to start building more of a global footprint around their Salesforce team. I think that's another trend that is, perhaps obvious just given the times that we're in with remote work and all of that. But there's a lot of companies that we'll work with that are, starting to experiment with hiring Salesforce talent in, Latin America, or Salesforce talent in India, which, I think scaling offshore development teams has always been common when you look at the top, 5% of the market, the biggest companies who are set up from a HR legal compliance perspective to go anywhere in the world and hire talent. We're starting to see companies at earlier and earlier stages hire outside of the US, which I'm a massive proponent of. I think, companies who are hiring remotely, but then constraining themselves to the US region exclusively, it sort of baffles me, right? Because you've done all the hard work of figuring out how to make a remote culture work. Why not now expand the geography that you're willing to take people on in? And, there's certainly cost benefits, but I also think there's productivity benefits. If half your team is in the US and half is in India, you're effectively getting a 24-hour development cycle instead of an 8 to 10 hour development cycle, which, when structured and planned properly, can have enormous benefits just from an output perspective. Um, so yeah, I think, companies will sort of use contractors. Some it's just a set project. Others it is a little bit of a, try before you buy type of situation, until they better understand what they need, and then, take things over.
So I guess no conversation is complete unless we at least understand where AI or GPT might play. Where are you seeing it in your world?
It's such an interesting one because I feel like I'm, at least from the perspective we have, I'm waiting to see more of it than I am currently. Um, we operate sort of all throughout different growth stages. So earlier stage startups up to, enterprise. I don't personally haven't seen, I've seen, some proof of concept stuff that, is being talked about by Salesforce or by partners. But I think, a lot of what I have been seeing is more around like the generative use case, which I think is only barely, scratching the surface. Um, Around, what the real capabilities will be. So, you see that a lot specifically within go to market teams using it for, sales or marketing use cases. I think the one area, and this is, I've seen it a little bit more in, your sort of high growth SaaS stage. So we're talking companies that are maybe, 50 to 150 million ARR, still, growing fast, but still in that sort of earlier end of the curve. One area that I've consistently started to see it adopted is around deal desk operations, right? So that is, I think, one of the biggest thorns in the side of companies at that stage is CPQ and general CPQ and billing infrastructure. And so what you see is, you know, well-designed CPQ instances that exist in a company that is in such a rapid state of change and experimentation, specifically with things like pricing strategy and, product bundling or new product SKUs being released, that you can very quickly outgrow your initial CPQ instance, even if it was perfectly built. And so then what you see is you sort of need to put band-aids on that problem by putting deal desk analysts on it. You're basically just filling in gaps with someone who's manually, pushing buttons or reviewing contracts. And so we're starting to see predictive insights layered on to the deal desk, the deal strategy side of revenue operations, where now you have a tremendous amount of aggregated data on specific deals that closed successfully. How were they priced? What were the different, parties that were involved on the client side? You can very easily synthesize insights to help with, pricing and quoting with the flip of a switch that currently takes you getting the sales rep in the room with the deal desk analyst, with the finance manager, with, sales leaders manually going through and looking at data and coming up with how they should price a deal. And I think that's going to be an area that we really quickly see AI and predictive analytics specifically get very sophisticated, because that's the kind of workflow where it's fairly well constrained by rules, right? If you've got good pricing rules in place, like it should be a pretty binary calculation of how should we price this deal. But because data, there is disparate data and it hasn't fully been synthesized in a lot of these companies, it's hard to do that effectively with humans. And I think that is something that you can very easily pour into models, and we've started to see companies do that somewhat successfully.
Let me give you a different perspective in your world. You think about business analysts, project managers, and the consultant type role, architect. They deal in words all the time. We're seeing examples now where GPT can give 100x productivity improvements in some of the things that they're delivering now. It's just starting to happen. But the idea that you could take the output of a transcript of an interview, turn it into a process map automatically. It can generate the entity relationship diagram. You could take that and automatically build user stories in a fraction of the time, and then go back and ask any question for your org. I think we'll see more of that, which I think you've talked about how GPT impacts using Salesforce, but actually I think there's a whole bunch of work to be done understanding how you can incorporate it into the act of managing Salesforce. You think about how much metadata there is. That can very easily be mined for. Max has a question could be: tell me why Max has got access to the resource object in that field. We've got all the data. We can tell you that. Or I've got a new person just joining. I want to give them the same permissions as Max. What are those? Which should take you hours wading through profiles and permission sets. So I think we'll also see quite a lot in terms of supporting the whole Salesforce management activities. And again,
yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And I think when you look at it more on an infrastructure level, you look at, I think technical debt it's an enormous issue across so many different Salesforce orgs. Some because it was, you shouldn't have built the things you built or built them the way you built them. Others, it's a natural evolution of your Salesforce org. If you've had it for 15 years, you've outgrown things that were built in the past. So it's an inevitability that it will accrue. And I think you're absolutely right that, you look at plugging tools in that have access to Salesforce that can do, a top-down audit in a matter of, seconds, minutes, to really get a health score assessment on, different elements of where, code exists and it has been deprecated and needs to be cleaned up or needs to be refactored, or integrations in the same way. You now think about, and I don't know that there are tools yet, and correct me if I'm wrong, where you can then directly connect that to AI that has the capability to go ahead and do that work, perhaps with some inputs from, a developer who you're then boosting their capability. But you're absolutely right that when you look at the sheer amount of metadata that exists at all levels within Salesforce, you plug that into, AI with, a sort of an AI copilot, development copilot, with some parameters around how you want it to handle specific situations. You look at something like tech debt remediation effectively on autopilot. Whether we're there right now or we're about to be there, I think you're absolutely right. We're going to get there very quickly, and that's going to be a massive unlock.
I think we're virtually there. The stuff that we're releasing is already there. I mean, I'll give you an example, which was it knows. So let's take stage field on opportunity. Typically, multiple pick list values. Those pick list values kick off workflows or Apex or automations. So we gave it the dependency tree of these are all the things it's connected to. We just gave it all the metadata. And we also calculate the complexity of every metadata item based on what's in it. So the complexity of a flow and so on. And then we gave it a table of, for each metadata item based on complexity, this is roughly how long it would take to update. So we gave it all the metadata, so it knows all about that, it knows about the complexities, it knows about the dependencies, and we gave it one extra spreadsheet, which was this table, and said, I want to change and pick this value on stage. How long will it take? And it said 96 hours. Okay, so show me you're working, and it came back. Now, the skeptic might go, well, was it really 96 hours? That's not the point. It's not 3 hours and it's not 3,000 hours. It's in the 100-hour mark. So therefore, instead of the normal answer, which is it'll take 3 months because I've no idea what I'm opening up here, we're starting to direct the architect, the analyst into doing more research. You can start to think about what development resource you might need. Or you can go back to the business user and go, this is going to take 100 hours, at which point they go, oh, no, in that case, don't do it. I thought it was going to be 3 hours. In that case, no, spend the effort on something else which is more important. And I think that, whilst it won't necessarily do what you suggested, which is, okay, now hit the button, make the change to the org, it's doing a lot of that number crunching or the analytics that would typically take hours, or you may never do because it's too hard. And I think that's I think where I think we'll see the first lift is in terms of better decision making. The same way as your deal desk example, better decision making because I've now got the data around pricing a deal. Better decision making about should we make that change? What's the magnitude of the change we're trying to make? So I think over the next year we'll see, as people lean in, significant productivity improvements in some niche areas, and that's really exciting. Particularly if you could then bring us in your world, you could bring in someone who is an expert but actually doesn't have expertise on an org and get them up to speed really quickly. Suddenly that fractional model will work a lot better because they're not spending the first 2 days trying to work out what they're touching. They can actually get some tools which is suddenly they're going to give you some insights into the org and can work more quickly. So actually I think the whole model you've got there can actually be supported and supercharged by what we're doing with GPT now, which I think is really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think at the end of the day, with all of these tools, whether we do get to the point where it's fully taking that analysis and then writing and deploying the code or not, these tools are only going to be effective in the right hands, right? You're still going to need a degree of knowledge around what needs to be built, how it needs to be built. There have to be guardrails in place with these tools. Otherwise, I think we're starting to see some tools emerge where they can deploy, through natural language processing. It's sort of text to flow. I haven't seen it quite with code, but it's natural language processing flow builders that can be very effective if the right person is instructing it, because then you're managing all of the build work. The problem is now how easy it is to deploy flows, and potentially very complex flows, from someone who shouldn't be deploying the kinds of things that they're deploying in production, right? So it's very much, a double-edged sword in whichever direction this goes. But at the end of the day, it's got to be in the right hands in order for it to be effective long-term.
Absolutely. And I think the days of accidental admins hopefully are over, because I know that term will make me unpopular maybe in the ecosystem, but we really don't want accidental admins or accidental architects. We want people who've got the skills and they can actually deploy those, because it's now, the systems we're talking about are now becoming critical. And I think it's shown on your website when you start looking at some of the organizational structures that people are putting in place to manage their Salesforce orgs. You can see how they're taking it seriously. So it's been fascinating talking to Max, but for people listening, go to Found HQ and start looking at some of the data that you've put out there. And that hopefully will inspire you into what it takes to really deliver results from Salesforce. So again, thank you so much for joining me, Max. I think it's been a fascinating conversation.
Likewise. Thanks so much for having me in.
My pleasure.